Hey 207, I hope you're having an awesome day. I'm back to read chapter 10 of The Littles. This is the second to last chapter of our book, so we're almost finished. In chapter 9, we had a lot happen. So the Littles, this family, were trying to get rid of their mouse problem. There are mice in the house, and the mice were attacking the Littles. So Tom dressed up like a mouse to try and get the newcomes to put out mouse traps. But instead, they actually meet a cat. So we're going to read chapter 10 to figure out what happens next. Alright, here we go. Chapter 10. Mr. Little, Mrs. Little, and Granny Little were still in the living room when the other Littles hurried in. "Lucy!" yelled Mrs. Little. "I thought you were in your room. What happened, Will? Why is Lucy with you?" Mr. Little told his wife what had happened. "Lucky for us, Lucy decided to follow me when she did," he said. "I still can't believe it. She attacked that huge cat." He shook his head. "It's amazing," said Uncle Pete. "Absolutely amazing." "We were pinned under the logs, Mother," said Tom. "I never got a chance to shoot my bow and arrows." "What are we going to do about that cat?" said Uncle Pete. "Never thought they'd get a cat to chase the mice." "We're safe inside the walls, at least," said Mr. Little. "That monster won't be able to get us in here." "There's the problem of getting supplies," said Uncle Pete. "We'll have to leave the walls for that." "I think I know how we can get rid of that cat," said Mr. Little. "How?" said all the Littles. "By getting it in trouble," said Mr. Little. "We can pull down the curtains for one thing. The newcomes will blame it on the cat. We can keep spilling its milk. At night we can make loud cat noises to keep the newcomes awake. We can even knock over lamps so that they think the cat did it. Pretty soon, the newcomes will think they have the wrong kind of cat, and they'll want to get rid of it." Everybody agreed that Mr. Little's plan was a good plan. During the next few weeks, the newcomes came to believe that their cat was clumsy and noisy. One day, the cat seemed to knock over a lamp. Another time, the newcomes were awake half the night listening to the meowing. It was really the Littles making a terrible racket. The day after the curtains in the dining room were pulled down. "What do we do tomorrow, Dad?" said Tom. "May I spill the cat's milk?" "That's good. Yes," said Mr. Little. "It should be done 2 or 3 times in a row, though," said Mrs. Then Mrs. Newcomb will get awfully tired of cleaning it up. "There's only one thing wrong with this plan, Will," said Mrs. Little. "I don't know why you say that," said Mr. Little. "Everything has worked perfectly so far. What's the problem?" "The cat is still in the house," said Mrs. Little. "Don't worry," said Mr. Little. "It won't be here long." "Mrs. Newcomb must be mad as a wet hen by now," said Uncle Pete. The next day, Tom had a close call. Just as he was lifting the cat's milk dish to spill it on for the 3rd time, the cat showed up. The huge animal came pounding towards Tom. At the last moment, Tom upset the milk dish under the cat's nose, then stopped the cat long enough for Tom to get away. Do you see him? So he's knocking over the little milk dish to make a big mess, and the cat catches him. "This plan of yours is too slow, Will," said Uncle Pete. "We're going to have to do something else before that cat gets one of us." "What can we do?" said Mr. Little. "We need larger weapons," said Uncle Pete. "I don't know if that's the answer, Uncle Pete," said Mr. Little. "Besides, that takes time, too. You're right, though. This plan isn't working. I heard Mrs. Newcomb telling Mr. Newcomb now to get rid of the cat. She's afraid the mice will return." "And she likes cats," said Mr. Little. "Thinks it's cute. She says it's high-spirited." "Not only that," said Mrs. Little, We can't break up everything in the house just to get rid of that cat. It's the Big's house after all. Why don't we try taming the cat, said Tom. What? Said Uncle Pete. Let's see if we can tame it, repeated Tom. Cats have been friends to men since the early days of history. Uncle Pete looked from Mrs. Little to Mr. Little. Do you hear what this boy is saying? He said. He's gone soft in the head. No kidding, Dad, said Tom. It's true. The early Egyptians thought cats were gods. They had them all over the place. They did they? Said Uncle Pete. Where'd you hear that nonsense? I read it in one of the Big's history books, said Tom. Uncle Pete snorted. A cat has never been a friend to a little, I can tell you that. Maybe that's because none of them ever tried to tame a cat, said Tom. They were always afraid of cats. What kind of silly talk is that, boy? Said Uncle Pete. Look at the size of that beast. Who could tame such a monster? Men tame elephants, said Tom. Tom has an interesting idea, said Mr. Little. Perhaps we're worried too much about the size of the cat. Because we're so small, we've always thought all large animals were our enemies. Maybe that's wrong. I don't like the way this talk is going, said Uncle Pete. It's against everything we littles believe. Making friends with a cat is like making friends with a rattlesnake. Tom is saying it's not the same thing, said Mr. Little. Cats are friendly to men. Rattlesnakes are not. None of the littles spoke. Now, we may be little, said Mr. Little, but we are men. Of course we are, said Uncle Pete. He looked sideways at his tail. We're not animals. Then why can't we have a cat around the house just like other people? All of the silly ideas, said Uncle Pete. Oh dear, said Mrs. Little. It all sounds right, but I just don't know. Why, it's a wonderful idea, said Granny Little. It's so simple. Simple-minded, said Uncle Pete. Why didn't someone think of it before, said Granny Little. Because it's cuckoo, that's why, said Uncle Pete. Now see here, Peter Little, said Granny. Mind your manners. She stood up. Her ball of knitting yarn fell from her lap. It rolled between Mr. Little's feet. I've lived a few more days than you have, and I know a few more things than you do too. Mr. Little picked up the ball of yarn. He tossed it gently in the air a few times. We could start tame the cat by giving her a present. Show her we mean to be friendly. Give her something to play with, said Tom. How about that ball of yarn your father is fiddling with, said Granny Little. Don't cats like to play with things like that? As a matter of fact, Granny, they do, said Mr. Little. Will that make her friendly, said Mrs. Little. It might help, said Mr. Little. We could roll a ball of yarn at the cat and see what happens. All we have to do is make sure we have room to get out of the way if she doesn't like the idea. I'm against it, said Uncle Pete. Too dangerous. Cats are cats. You can't change them. There's a large ball of yarn in Mrs. Big's sewing basket, said Lucy. I lifted it once. It's larger than anything. It's lighter than anything. Let's get it, said Mr. Little. I think it's worth trying. He looked at Uncle Pete. That is, if no one else has any better ideas. Count me out, said Uncle Pete. I'll stay here and sharpen my sword. That is the end of chapter 10. What do you guys think? Are the littles going to be able to be friends with the cat? Yes or no? Don't forget, as always, there are some questions you can answer in a Kahoot in the description. I'll be back to read the last chapter of Littles. Talk to you guys later.